Well, here are some more books in the from the Torah. Well, yeah, they're still from the Torah, or the Old Testament. I'm going to begin to call this the Old Testament. After Genesis and Exodus, and I feel like I'm finished with Exodus now. The story of Moses, we left him behind. He was not allowed to go into the Promised Land. Joshua was the leader then that took the Hebrew people into the Promised Land. I like to ask the students, so can anybody out there name the books of the Old Testament? And at least in this part of the United States, I'll very often have a student that can name every one. Well, not every year, but now and then I'll run into somebody who can. But they can usually start. And they'll go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, and on they'll go. Numbers, Deuteronomy, wait a minute. Well, anyway, there's some books in there that don't have stories that are all that famous. So for my purposes, I just skip them. I'm not a Sunday school teacher. I'm not a biblical scholar. But there are some very famous stories. We get to Joshua, and there are very famous stories. The name itself, Joshua, an extremely common boy's name, at least in this part of the world. In that book, you'll read about the city of Jericho. That's the oldest, I think it's the oldest city in the world, Jericho. I mean, speaking from the point of view of an archaeologist. He blew his trumpet, marched around the city 7 times before that, banged shields, something, and the walls came tumbling down. And there's a song about that, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho. Probably more than one song. You could find it on YouTube, I'm sure. Well, then Judges. I like to point out that in Judges, there's a whole bunch of really famous stories, interesting stories. There's where you'll find the story of Gideon's army. Gideon was told that, he was to do battle, but his army wasn't big enough, and he asked God what to do about it. And God said, well, get rid of a bunch of your guys. Your army's too big. That seemed counterintuitive. But Gideon said, okay, and how would he know who to keep? And they watch. I like to ask the students to see if any of them know, and usually there's some students that do. He watched them drink at a spring, and the ones that put their faces down to the water and drank, he didn't want them. He wanted the ones that scooped the water up and drank like this, because they were wily, they were looking all the time. They were the ones he wanted. And then Gideon wins this battle by striking a panic in the hearts of the enemy. At night, every one of them builds a bonfire enough for a site for 20 guys to camp around. Really, there's only one. But it was at night, and the enemy thought that it was a vast army. Then I think every one of them blew a horn, and everyone broke pots or smashed shields or something, and attacked, and there was such a panic that Gideon won the battle. Samson, he's famous for his hair, his long hair. If you cut his hair, he'd lose his strength. And Delilah was his woman. I'm going to say it's his woman. I'm not sure if she was his wife or not. I don't think she was, I'm pretty sure Delilah was not a Hebrew. Anyway, Delilah arranged for a barber to cut his hair. He lost his strength, and then they had this sort of superhero under their control. They blinded him, and I think the book Eyeless in Gaza is an allusion to that blinding, although I've never read that book. But then he prays to get his strength back, and when he's chained to the pillars, he pulls the pillars together, and the temple falls down on him and everybody. Deborah was one of the judges. These are judges, not kings yet. They didn't have kings. They had judges, leaders that rose up. Well, Deborah, the thing I mostly remember about her, I've read the story, but I remember what she did to her enemy. I call her nail driving. Well, she took a tent peg, and while her enemy was sleeping in her tent, she nailed his head to the ground with a hammer and a tent peg. She drove it through his head and nailed him to the ground. Pretty violent act. And Deborah is such a common name. Last year, in the school where I was teaching before I retired, I think there were at least 3 women on the staff with the name Deborah. And I'd like to point that out to the kids. I say, now you just remember that with that. You get messing around with those women there, just remember who they're named for. Anyway, now, so much for Judges. Then you come to the book of Ruth. It's a fairly short book. Naomi, with Naomi, that's the other character whose name you might know. I have had students named Naomi. I have had students or known people named Ruth. Maybe not terribly common names, but they're used. This is almost like a love story between women. I think Ruth was the daughter-in-law to Naomi, although I sometimes get this mixed up. And when her husband died, she could have left and gone back to her people, but she did not. Or at least she stayed with Naomi. She kept Naomi with her. I hope I'm getting this right. Comment. Send me a comment if I've got this wrong. That's fine. And she is rewarded for being the good woman that she is. She gets a new husband in the land that she travels to. I wrote Canaan down because at some point I should have said that. Canaan is another way of referring to the promised land. Now this will bring us to the point where I'll take up the stories about King David. You'll find them in Samuel 1 and 2. I'll run over them for a couple days, and shortly after, and after that, we're going to leave Hebrew literature behind and go over to Greek literature. Well, I hope you're back tomorrow. Wait. I wanted to apologize if my hand was shaking a little bit when I was holding that camera. Well, it's cold down here in the barn. You're going to see me in overalls eventually, and gloves probably, since I am teaching in an unheated building so far. But I also hope to get the heat going. So anyway, my apologies. Most of the time you can't tell, except I'm sticking my hands in my pockets all the time. Now I'm ready to say, I hope to see you tomorrow.